Hello, everyone. It's John Berry here. This is my talk for the Gold Medal Award from the Canadian Psychological Association. I wish to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and also the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I also wish to thank the Canadian Psychological Association for the honor of awarding me this gold medal. This is because CPA, and particularly the International Cross-Cultural Psychology section, has been my scientific and professional home for over 50 years. I thank everyone for their support. In this presentation, I'll briefly outline some historical antecedents to understanding how we can live together in culturally diverse societies. And I'm going to argue that there are some principles of intercultural relations that may be widespread around the world, even universal, in the sense that they operate similarly in many different societies. Each principle that I'm going to talk about is rooted in the Canadian policy of multiculturalism, whose goal is to promote more positive relationships amongst all ethnocultural communities in the country. The search for an answer to this question, how shall we all live together, will examine each of these three principles and employ examples of research both internationally and in Canada. I will then draw some conclusions and consider some implications for intercultural policy and practice. As we all know, Canada has been culturally diverse since the beginning of human settlement. First, of course, the Indigenous peoples settled thousands of years ago and occupied different ecological regions, each with distinct cultures and languages. And a little over 500 years ago, John Cabot arrived in what is now Newfoundland, and a few years later, there were Portuguese, Basque, and French peoples in that region. And later, of course, other people from different parts of Europe arrived, colonized the territory, and established economic and political control over those who were already here. And again, as we already know, from 1960s on, people from the world have come to live in this country. The question of how to deal with this diversity has been sometimes implicit, but more recently explicit. The original assumption was that everyone living in this territory would form a single unitary, mainly European-based society. For some anyway, but others we engage in a form of segregation, particularly for Indigenous peoples, and we excluded others who were deemed, as was then called, unassimilable. And the goal was to create one people from many disparate ethnocultural communities, or alternatively, to simply cast others to one side. The question of how to live together became more explicit with John Buchan's argument that each group should retain their individuality and make its contribution to the national character, and each should learn from the other. That is, we should encourage the continuation of cultural differences and engage in social interactions amongst the various communities. This insight in 1925 set us off on our own 39 steps to better recognize and accept our increasing diversity. A few years later, at an international conference in Cuba, the Canadian paper dealing with this question argued that Canada should be built on the ideas of individual worth and cultural difference. And the pressure of one dominant group to assimilate, that is, to absorb others, is therefore impractical as a general theory. And this was a further step towards recognizing that cultural diversity was really what we were all about. Later in the 60s, there was increasing campaign, most strongly expressed by the Ukrainian Canadian community, that we needed to follow these leads by Buchan and quoted in Berry and become a multicultural society. And following these early steps, making more explicit what we were all about, was the announcement in 1971 of an official policy called multiculturalism within a bilingual framework. The argument in that policy statement was that such a policy should break down discriminatory attitudes and cultural jealousies. And then it also argued that if we have confidence in our own individual identity, we can develop respect for others and a willingness to share ideas, attitudes, and assumptions among ourselves. And it went on to say that the government will support and encourage various cultural and ethnic groups to share their cultural expression and values with other Canadians and thereby contribute to a richer life. So in this policy statement, we see a continuing emphasis on the two core principles of multiculturalism. First, the value of maintaining cultures over generations, and by having these cultures in place, it provides a secure place for everyone. Equally important is that of social engagement and participation among all cultural communities in order to share our many cultures. Note that both principles are essential. That is, it's an intercultural policy, not one that only promotes diversity, it also promotes social engagement and interaction. So the maintenance of cultural communities over generations we can call the cultural component. And the interaction or engagement component we can refer to it as the social component. And the two in balance are the essence of Canadian multiculturalism. So in addition to these core components, there are also important links amongst them. These links provide the basis for three hypotheses that can be examined by research. The multiculturalism hypothesis, the contact hypothesis, and the integration hypothesis, which is shown in this figure that was published in the 1980s as a way of analyzing the social psychological features of the policy. The policy goal, as we've seen, is to improve the mutual acceptance of all communities living in Canada, and that's in the upper right. And this was to be accomplished by three basic planks in the policy. In the upper left, we call it the cultural component, that is to say, promote the maintenance and development of ethnocultural groups over generations. And lower left, the social component, to provide opportunities and to break down barriers for intergroup contact and participation. And because it was called multiculturalism policy within a bilingual framework, we have the component on the lower right, which is called a communication component, and that is to encourage everyone to learn the two official languages, French and English, of Canada. The links amongst them that I just mentioned give rise to three hypotheses. One is the multiculturalism hypothesis that links the two upper components. And that is that when you have confidence and feel secure in your place in Canadian society, on the left, it should breed mutual acceptance. Confidence allows you to accept those who are different from yourself. The second hypothesis is the contact hypothesis, which is well known in psychology, and that is intergroup contact and participation should enhance the mutual acceptance amongst all groups that are in contact. The third hypothesis, the integration hypothesis, is that when you have a balance between cultural maintenance and social participation, that is to say, when you're involved, each group with the other, then you will have increased mutual acceptance and well-being. And finally, although not an hypothesis, the link here is that when you have competence in either one or both of the two languages, you have the capacity to engage in social interaction, and this should increase mutual understanding and acceptance, going from the lower right to the upper right. So I've just explained that the multiculturalism hypothesis is that when you have a sense of confidence or security in your identity, you will be in a psychological position to accept those in your midst who are culturally different. And if we look at the converse, when one's identity is threatened or undermined, people reject other people. The contact hypothesis is that when social contact and sharing are present, particularly positive contact, this should promote mutual acceptance under certain conditions, especially when contact is voluntary and of relatively equal status. The integration hypothesis is that individuals who maintain their heritage cultures and identities and who also engage with the larger society are likely to be more successful in their intercultural living than those who pursue only one of these. So, of course, many disciplines contribute to our understanding of how to live together, including anthropology, economics, ethnic studies, political science, sociology. But they all work at the societal level, looking at groups and institutions and how they relate to each other. The role of psychology is to work at the individual level to examine attitudes, beliefs, stereotypes, behaviors, and motives. And these two levels are connected because these external factors, these group-level factors, provide the nexus within which individuals develop and act psychologically in their daily lives. So a lot of psychological research has been going on in Canada on the issue of how to live together. We have been carrying out such studies at least since the 1960s, and the goal is to provide evidence to improve the lives and the mutual acceptance of everyone living in a culturally diverse society such as Canada. And my own research and advocacy work over the past 50 years has maintained a focus on this question both in Canada and internationally in a number of other societies. The main concepts employed in this research are acculturation and intercultural relations. Acculturation is defined as the process of cultural and psychological change that results from contact between different cultural groups and their individual members. These cultural changes in groups and psychological changes in their members present challenges and opportunities very often, but over time, cultural and psychological adaptations emerge that may lead to either positive or negative intercultural relations. These adaptations are often linked to a particular experience of individuals, making it possible to identify which of these experiences will promote or perhaps undermine personal well-being and positive relations. So when we want to study these issues, it's useful to have a map of the variables that we're concerned with. And over the years, I have evolved this framework that deals with core concepts and relationships amongst them in the domains of acculturation and intercultural relations. So this framework shows on the left that we have some important information to gather from the cultural groups in contact. In the minimal case, we have two cultures, A and B, are in contact with each other, and they produce cultural changes in organization, structure, economic activity, and so on in both these cultures. So we need to understand the features of culture A and culture B that are brought to the contact situation. We need to understand the nature of the contact, whether it's invasion or less negative form of contact, and we need to examine what changes have taken place at the cultural level as a result of this contact. This information at the group or cultural level provides the context for us to study the psychological or individual level features over on the right-hand side. And here we have two main sets of variables. One we call psychological acculturation, and the other we call adaptation. Here we study samples of individuals in both cultures, or more usually, and we look at their behavioral changes. How do they change their attitudes and behaviors in day-to-day life? What are the stress reactions, the acculturative stress, to any challenges that are experienced? And then we also look at the strategies, the way individuals come to understand how they might try to live together in the plural society. On the right-hand side, we have the eventual long-term adaptations where people settle into a way of living more or less successfully. And we have three kinds of adaptation that have been examined in the literature. Sociocultural, that is, doing well, such as at work or at school, or engaging in social relationships. Psychological, that is, feeling well, personal well-being, good mental health, high self-esteem, and so on. And thirdly, intercultural, this is achieving a level of tolerance and low level of prejudice, and something we call a multicultural ideological orientation to other groups in the diverse society. So I have just gone through these components, and these next slides show them in a little bit more detail, but I think that the overall picture is fairly clear. The group level variables provide the context for the interpretation. The psychological level variables shown over on the right. Now, one of the main areas of research in acculturation and intercultural relation is the concept of strategies. That is, how do people try to engage each other in these plural societies? So one is the strategies of people about how themselves should change, and the other is the expectations that people have about others and how they relate to each other. This framework explains these two strategies and expectations on the left-hand side for the ethnocultural communities, and on the right-hand side for the larger society as a civic and political entity. And the two issues that were in the Canadian multiculturalism policy that we described before, issue one is the maintenance of heritage, culture, and identity, and people can have a positive orientation on the left or a negative orientation to maintaining heritage culture. And the second issue is whether the social relationships should take place, engagements between members of different communities, and at one end we have a positive orientation, at the other end we have a negative orientation. And on the left-hand side, as I mentioned, we have the terms that are used to study and understand the ethnocultural communities, and on the right we have the strategies of the larger society. And so if we look at these terms within this intercultural space, assimilation is a term we know well, and it's when there's a negative view towards maintaining one's culture and a positive view towards just getting into and participating along with others in the larger society. The opposite strategy is called separation, and that's when there's a very high level positive value on maintaining one's heritage culture, but and it's to be done by having it possible to do with the larger society. Marginalization refers to losing both the heritage culture and not participating in either society. And integration strategy is the maintaining of the heritage culture and at the same time participating in the society. On the right-hand side of that figure, we have what are called expectations by others about how you should engage your daily life in the diverse society. So when we talk about assimilation for oneself, the expectations are referred to as the melting pot. This is the view that everyone should be combined into a single society with no serious cultural differences. When we think of separation as a way people may want themselves to engage with the larger society, we see the term segregation is used when the expectation in that larger society is that all groups should maintain separate communities. Marginalization, when imposed by the larger society, is called exclusion. People should have little left of their heritage culture and still stay outside the larger society. And with respect to integration, when both diversity and social inclusion are widely valued features of the larger society, we have the basic core values of multiculturalism. Now, in the diagram, I propose three hypotheses that can be investigated to look at how and how well people relate to each other in these plural societies. My argument is that if they are widely supported, we may move from being hypotheses to being principles of acculturation and intercultural relations that can guide how to live together more successfully in a number of diverse societies. So research in Canada began in the early 1970s with a large-scale national survey done with the late Rudy Kalin and the late Don Taylor, published as a book called Multiculturalism and Ethnic Attitudes in Canada in 1977. And this work was to some extent based upon earlier work I had done in Australia before moving back to. Subsequently, my work has involved research with Indigenous peoples in Canada, the Cree in Quebec and Ontario, the Dene and Tsimshian in British Columbia, and subsequently we worked with various immigrant and refugee groups in various communities in Quebec and Ontario, including Vietnamese, Chinese, and so on, that had a focus mainly on young people and how they were learning to live together. And most recently, using large databases from Statistics Canada, we have looked at first and second generation immigrants to Canada. The most recent study, published just a few years ago, called Mutual Intercultural Relations, and a meta-analysis of that data was published just last year in Applied Psychology. The goal of this study is to examine these three hypotheses to establish whether they were valid or supported in these 20 societies. And we found that in the societies in the initial analysis, there were 17, and there were 111 evaluations of the three hypotheses, and 50 of these evaluations were in the national samples, the larger society, and 61 of them were in various ethnocultural group samples. In this book version, we found that the integration hypothesis was supported in 86% of the evaluations, multiculturalism at 92%, and contact supported in 85%. And there were very few contrary findings where the differences between the variables went opposite to the hypothesized direction. Here is a table that shows the national and ethnic samples along the top. A plus sign means that there was a supportive finding at the 0.5 level or higher. And 0 means there was no relationship, and a negative sign means that there was a contrary finding. And we see there that the vast majority of the high support of evidence for the hypotheses were in the direction of support. More recently, we put all the data together and not just looking at it country by country, and we found that in a meta-analysis that there was modest support for each of these three hypotheses, with effect sizes in the range that is generally found for current pre-registered psychological research. And we conclude that this further analysis provides support for the three hypotheses. And this level of support may provide a basis for claiming them to be universal principles of acculturation and intercultural relations. Here are the details for the meta-analysis, probably too complicated to read at this moment. So we conclude that the meta-analysis provides further support beyond the country-by-country analysis reported in the book. And I want to be clear that when we claim them to be universal principles of intercultural relations, we don't mean that the phenomenon is invariant across groups, but it means that the underlying processes are shared psychological attributes that become manifested and expressed in variable ways under different cultural conditions. So it's not that they are exactly the same everywhere, but that the principles underlying them are generally supported and can be detected using different techniques at the surface level. So the integration hypothesis is probably the most interesting one to look at in further detail. The idea here is that when you are doubly engaged in both your heritage culture and in the life of the larger society, you will feel well psychologically, you do well socioculturally, and you will relate well with others interculturally. We propose that the integration strategy, which is sometimes called biculturalism in the international literature, but not particularly in Canada because it has a different meaning here, will provide a basis for more successful adaptation to intercultural living. In contrast to the integration strategy being most successful, assimilation and separation will have lower levels of success, and in particular the marginalization strategy will have the very much lower level of success. So one source of evidence for this claim is a study with over 5,000 immigrants and members of ethnocultural communities settled in 13 countries. There's a book in 2006, and there's an overview article also in 2006 that lays out this. We used a number of intercultural variables with both samples and found that about 36% were integration in their orientation. That is to say, they had combined orientation positive to their ethnic and to the national society in which they lived. Less than 20% were oriented towards assimilation. A little bit more than 20% were oriented towards separation and marginalization, which in this study we referred to as diffuse, rather than being marginal, and they were oriented towards neither their own group nor the larger society. We then examined the members of these clusters in relation to psychological and social adaptation. Figure shows pretty clearly that when you take the average scores, that's the zero line across the middle, and look at those in the integration, the ethnic or separation, the national or assimilation, diffuse or marginalization clusters, we get quite dramatic differences in the psychological and sociocultural adaptation indicators. Those in the integration cluster had positive psychological and sociocultural adaptation. Those in the marginal or diffuse cluster had dramatically lower indicators in both. And quite interestingly, the psychological adaptation was higher in the separation or ethnic cluster, but the sociocultural was lower. That's not surprising. But what is a surprise is that those in the assimilation or national cluster had both lower sociocultural and psychological adaptation. We also looked at the effect of discrimination, and we found that those in the integration and assimilation cluster had the lowest experience of discrimination, but highest for those in the separation and marginalization clusters. And this suggests some degree of reciprocity in intercultural relations. That is, if you hate me, I will hate you. If you discriminate against me, I will reject you. And then, not shown here in the structural equation model, discrimination was the single most important variable in suppressing both adaptation. So from this study, we concluded that the integration strategy is most favorable way for youth to acculturate and to engage in intercultural relations. And more recent analyses of these data using different methods and controlling for other variables, particularly for discrimination, generally confirms this conclusion. Given that this study was carried out in a number of societies, we may claim some degree of generalizability for this conclusion. We have recently seen a publication by Paul and Florian Schmitz, who looked at the relationships between the four strategies and a number of different psychological outcomes. Their study included 61 papers with over 40,000 participants and examined 30 correlates. In the following figures, they use a bubble plot to represent one study, and the size of the bubble corresponds with the magnitude, and the location of the bubble corresponds to the direction of the correlation. And so just to sample some of their findings, we see that integration, assimilation, separation, marginalization are listed on the left. And in the middle, we see the findings. And on the right, we see the numerical findings. So just scanning down from top to bottom for psychological adjustment, psychological adaptation, integration has more positive outcomes than assimilation, those in relation to separation, and much more than marginalization. General stress, the opposite pattern, highest for marginalization and lowest for integration. Depression, again, the same pattern. Mental health problems. Psychosomatic complaints, not much variation. So we can conclude on these psychological adaptation variables that evidence exists for the integration hypothesis. When we look again at some psychological adaptation variables, the most common variables used are life satisfaction and self-esteem. And here we see that integration and assimilation are generally equal and more positive than separation and marginalization. For self-esteem, integration is more positive than the other three, particularly marginalization. For sociocultural adaptation, we find that assimilation and integration are relatively equal, and separation and marginalization lower outcome. academic achievement, interesting, corresponding to the ICSEY study, that you get better academic outcomes when you're engaged in both your cultures than when you engage in one or the other. And then for professional achievement, we get much the same. So this pattern of relationships, I think, is very clear. The relationship between the four strategies of psychological well-being and sociocultural adaptation, we find that integration is generally supported, and only for one or two is assimilation equally successful strategy for the people in this meta-analysis. So we conclude from this meta-analysis of the relationships between strategies and adaptation that the strategies do matter, and they are systematically related to various forms of adaptation. And specifically, the integration strategy is associated with higher levels of psychological and sociocultural adaptation. Now, more recently, research in Canada has shown that there is further evidence for the integration hypothesis. With Feng Hu at Statistics Canada, we've been carrying out subsequent analyses of the General Social Survey that examines both first and second and later generations in Canada. In the studies, we have about 8,000 participants, made up of about 4,000, 5,000 first generation, and a slightly lower number of those as second generation. And we used the concept of sense of belonging to generate the orientations, the strategies that people seem to have. How would you describe your sense of belonging to Canada? And what about your sense of belonging to your country of origin for first generation, or ethnic group for second and later generations? And what we found was a high percentage belonging to both, that is to say, a double engagement, a double orientation, with relatively few having no strong belonging to any group. And we used two measures of well-being. All things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? And positive mental health in general, would you say your mental health is excellent? We then looked at the mean scores for these two variables in the four groups that we got by crossing the two sensible factors. In both generations, we found that a strong sense of belonging to both have the highest life satisfaction, and those not belonging to any group have the lowest. And this confirms the integration hypothesis. For mental health, for both generations, there's a pattern. The differences in strategies, however, are not great. That is to say, the number deciding that integration is the way to do it is somewhat higher in the second generation, and those believing that assimilation is the way to live in Canada actually goes down, contrary to what many people would expect. That is to say, this double engagement is considered to be the wiser choice, and giving up on your heritage culture and assimilating is a lesser choice for people in these two samples. And we noticed that those who arrived earlier, the integration strategy was only marginally different from those who arrived later, and for assimilation, we have much the same pattern. For life satisfaction, the differences across the four strategy groups was significant, and there were specific mean differences between integration and marginalization in particular. And the assimilation and separation groups had similar levels of life satisfaction, and both groups had higher levels than for those marginalization group. And for mental health, the results were similar. The question inevitably arises about the differences between the two samples. The differences are present but not incredibly different. And this speaks to the issue of whether there are problems in the first generation that have become associated or were associated with migration experience, and whether only the people who are more positive in their mental health are the ones who choose to immigrate. So these findings raise questions about the widely held view that immigrants have poorer well-being than those of born country. So what are some of the implications for personal well-being and positive intercultural relations? I think these concepts and empirical findings may be used to suggest the path forward to achieving well-being and positive intercultural relations for both immigrants and for members of the larger society during this process. Integration, that is to say, the double engagement in both one's own cultural community and in the larger society is not only possible, that is to say, it's common, but it's attainable and frequent. There appears to be no contradiction and no need to choose between different cultural identities and practices. Not only is the integration strategy the most preferred, in most societies associated with the most desirable outcomes, greater personal well-being and positive social and intercultural relations. In the multiculturalism vision, these empirical findings suggest that we may have found a better way forward, a best way forward, using the integration strategy and avoiding marginalization, but to some extent also assimilation works well. Given the advantages that we find in this research from the integration and multicultural approach, is it possible to emulate this transition to multiculturalism in other plural societies? The lesson here is that change took place in Canada in the last century, and so it might be possible that we could argue that such change could also take place in other societies. So what conditions might be necessary for other societies to move towards this more pluralist or multicultural vision? One possible answer is that the kind of evidence provided by these studies may be useful to persuade other culturally diverse societies to move away from strict assimilation policies or segregation policies in order to a multicultural one. And I think if we are armed and try to convince policymakers that these concepts, frameworks, and findings are valid, it should be possible to develop policy-relevant research and practice in many culturally plural societies. In this program of research, I think you will have noticed that we started with policy, assumptions underlying Canadian policy, moved to research, and now we are now back to promoting policy outcomes. And what do we need to do in order to improve health, education, justice, and labor in these plural societies? We can link them to the three principles that we've been studying. Provide a culturally, economically, and personally secure place for all individuals and groups in the society. That's the multiculturalism hypothesis. Support the contact and engagement of diverse individuals and groups within countries. That's the contact hypothesis. And advocate for the development of multiple and integrated identities rather than one single national or ethnic identity. Policies that are evidence-based, I think, are more likely to be persuasive. However, such evidence alone cannot bring about the change. Other factors are important, particularly public opinion, political leadership, and the availability of resources. So one way to proceed is to enhance public education about the benefits of multiculturalism, articulating the claim that life for everyone is enriched personally, culturally, and economically in multicultural societies. Thank you very much for your attention. Merci, miigwech.